Hi, folks. I'm Dan Dworkis, and this is the Emergency Mind podcast, a space where we bring together lessons from the emergency department and beyond about performing at our best when it matters the most and applying knowledge under pressure. We're going way outside the emergency department today, and I'm honored to bring on our guest, Dr. Marcin Nazaruk, who is an award-winning global expert in proactive learning. He helps companies to apply learning from normal work and practice through training and consultancy to transform safety, rebuild trust, and reduce risk. He's the lead author of the industry guides on the topic of learning from normal work by a wide variety of organizations in the oil and gas space. And he's developed a range of practical tools and solutions for the frontline and senior leaders alike. I am super excited about this. I've been a longtime follower of yours on LinkedIn and really enjoying the work that you've been putting out on that. And I think there's so much that the world of medicine can learn from what you and y'all are doing. And thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So there's a couple of different directions that I want to go, like so many directions all at once, just to start this off. But can you give folks just a real quick, brief overview of your background and how you got to be here and what sort of started you down this path?
Sure. Thanks so much. So I started in psychology long, long, long time ago. I wanted to move into clinical psychology, but after some early experiences, I decided it's not my cup of tea. And so then I transitioned to occupational. And after finishing my master's degree in Poland, I moved to the UK where I continued applying industrial psychology. And then I moved into the space of safety culture, safety leadership, human factors, human performance, and all the associated fields. And throughout my career, I was privileged to have very unique opportunities of being internal consultant in organizations and having access to all levels of the leadership. And so one day I could spend time with people in the front line and shuffling coal in the coal-fired um, power generation unit, and another day I would spend time attending a leadership meeting, understanding, listening to the strategy and everything in between, from engineers to supervisors to logistics to facilities. And those experiences were shaping the way I think, and I could see a mismatch between
Mm,
how what's happening in the front line and how they think and what they prioritize and what they focus on, and then different levels of leadership there. And throughout my career in oil and gas, I worked for BP and Baker Hughes. I was able then to apply a number of practical tools and operationalize a lot of different concepts and frameworks and theories, because I could bridge the world of academia
mm,
with the world of practical application. And so my early focus was on accident investigations and reactive learning,
mm,
but with the emergence of safety 2, human performance, system thinking, and some other fields, it became clear and clear that what we find in accident investigation reports, we also find when we talk to people. And that, of course, with Eric Holnagel's insight that failure and success have the same underpinnings, was a shift in my thinking, and then enabled me in a way to operationalize this idea and start finding the precursors of accidents before they happen. And that was the origins of learning from normal work.
love it. So I just want to draw a line here for folks listening to this who maybe aren't as experienced with a lot of these fields. So you might be wondering why we're having this conversation on this podcast, right? And to me, one of the big reasons is that the oil and gas industry in general is in many ways so much farther ahead of the medical field in terms of how it thinks about learning, how it thinks about investigating causes and safety and the structures around it, and the way that it thinks about the interplay between the actions of humans, the interactions of humans in a system, and the way the system as a whole supports or doesn't the type of work that we're trying to do. So I think medicine has a lot to learn from the oil and gas industry in that space, and particularly in the way that you're describing, where you're connecting the work that's really being done on what we would call the cutting and bleeding edge versus the
Mm.
way that the system as a whole is operating.
Mhm.
I love what you said that failure and success have the same underpinnings.
Mm.
That's such a good way to think about this, and I hope we
Mhm.
can drive in that direction a little bit. Why don't we start? I think we need to lay a little bit of groundwork for folks that haven't done as much thinking and processing in this space. Let's start with this. What is normal work? And
Mhm.
maybe that's like the biggest question we could possibly start with, but it's worth attacking it front on, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with work. So I
Mm.
do work in order to achieve certain goal. I want to do something, whether that is paint a wall, build a brick, or whatever the domain is. And now in order to accomplish that goal, I need resources, right? Whether that's people, tools, time, etc., whatever the context is. And then as I go about accomplishing this goal, I will start facing different challenges. The tool may be not the right type. I may not have enough time because something else popped up. It should be 3 people job, but now John was called in a sick day, and now we have 2 people. And so those are those challenges, and those challenges stem from many different sources. We can go into that, but overall, there is variability. Every day there may be something different about those aspects. And the fact that people adapt, people need to deal with that, right? If we have 2 people instead of 3, or I've got that tool instead of the other one, I need to deal with that in order to accomplish my goal. And now the way I accomplish or the way I adapt, deal with that may also vary. If the right tool is available, I may just grab it. If not, I may improvise it. If I can call in another person to have the team of 3 instead of 2, then I probably get it. But if it's not possible, realistic, or would increase time delays or would have other implications, I may try to find a way that makes most sense to me, given my experience and my
Mhm.
circumstances, to accomplish the work with 2 people. And so these adaptations to the ongoing variability and the ongoing challenges that we face, it's normal work, because it's normal. It's happening every day. Every job
Mm.
will have adaptations of different type depending on the unique combinations of circumstances. And so then learning from normal work is about proactively finding out those things and understanding which of those adaptations and constraints creates risk that needs to be addressed and prioritized for additional resourcing or some additional attention.
There's a bunch of scales that this works on, right? So you're talking about what is the normal work of a human within a system
Mhm.
trying to accomplish a task. But we also, if I'm reading this right, can apply this out at a broader scale to how does a team function solving a task, or even how does a system produce a process, right? Like that sort of idea of what adaptability and variation works on all of those levels.
Indeed. And the idea of adaptability partially comes from the system thinking discipline and seeing organizations as systems. And so systems are entities with multiple components that interact together. And yes, team will be a system and will have adaptive properties. I'm going a bit more too technical, perhaps.
No,
And the
it's
same
good.
with
Yeah.
organizations. This variability, it's easiest to see perhaps when we talk about simple activities like lift using a crane to lift a load, but that definitely
Mm.
happens at other levels, at the team level and organizational level. Yeah, it's more tricky to see and requires some additional um the eyesight or sensitivity to be able to spot how
Yeah.
teams and organizations adapt, but that's definitely happening.
All right. So I'd love to push on that for a second, because I think one of the themes that we've talked about in the Emergency Mind project quite a bit is the difference between the types of systems where one can develop expertise and the types
Mhm.
of systems where one remains a novice despite a large amount of time working in that system. So you can think very roughly about operations which are largely repeatable, where there is a tight coupling between process and outcome, or performance and outcome, where the outcome is quickly learnable. So you can really see what you're doing and you can adapt and iterate very quickly around what happens, right? A classic example of this is in sports, shooting a free throw or something in basketball, right? So very quickly, if you've succeeded or failed at it, it's largely dependent on how you do, and you can iterate and adjust over and over again relatively cheaply to learn from it. By comparison, a lot of emergency care has a large gap between performance and outcome, right? So
Mhm.
you can perform really well, and there can be other factors that still modulate the outcome. And you don't necessarily know if the outcome is due to your performance or due to some other part of the system. Sometimes there's a large temporal delay between learning the result of something and when you start from it. And often they're low frequency events where you don't get to repeatedly practice it or repeatedly go up against it. And so there's all this sort of, I guess I would call it slack in the system between what's happening and what you're learning. So when you're describing lifting a load with a crane, my mind goes to the type of system that you can develop expertise in. The
Mhm.
problem is relatively constrained and you can face the problem over and over again. What does variability and adaptation look like in a system that is a little bit more like what I'm describing from an emergency, where there's more slack, there's more temporal delay, it's lower frequency? How would we start thinking about those kind of terms as they apply in that space?
Yeah, perfect. So first of all, let's draw a boundary just for a boundary of what we mean by system. So if we take a team as a system, or we draw a boundary around the team and think of that as a system. So then the team members, first of all, will come with their own background and perspective, and will deal with the immediate situation. Now, when we talk about crane, that's a simplistic example because it helps to visualize what this is about. And we've got one person and we've got one piece of equipment and one part is missing. That's simple. Now, of course, you can increase the complexity by adding people and processes and variability in the context. So as I see it, when we have a team, now they bring in their context in order to deal with the environment, and that environment now consists of other team members as well. So for every team member needs to deal with other team members, assuming that there is free flow between everyone, and they face a range of different constraints in that situation. So that still may be the information that is available, which takes us to the uncertainty. It still may be tools. Time would be a big constraint. And so, therefore, both individually and as a team, they need to deal with that variability. Some aspects that you mentioned, whether that's time delays or whether there are other elements that bring in or add to the complexity of that situation. And now every person within that team will be trying to make sense of that given the dynamics of the situation. So I'm getting input from that person and from that person, and I'm seeing this situation and that situation and these tools. And we've got the group level sense making process as well as the individual sense making process. However, having said that, and linking back to the learning from normal work, teams that do a similar activity or so teams who do similar activity with certain frequency would be able to draw out from their experience pieces that they think would be helpful to them. So already if we do a debrief and think, okay, so we don't have negative outcome in the context of healthcare. The outcome was positive overall. The patient was released as per our plan. But even within that positive outcome, this team as a group of individuals would face a number of challenges and constraints, and they would be adapting dynamically. And if we
Gotcha.
then ask them, okay, so what made executing this tricky, difficult, frustrating? And if we ask them, what would you need to do it better next time or to
Mm,
reduce the risk next time? We would already be able to get the perspective because they would have this experience and past similar experiences that would inform the answer. And that could be the answers, therefore, would become a window into that variability. So even if we have a team of individuals who come together to deal with an emergency scenario and they've never met each other, but then we debrief them on what made this difficult and what would you need next time to do it even better. We would still get the answers from informed by this situation and similar situations in the past. Because in decision making, we also use our previous experiences and we generalize our previous experiences onto the situations. And the answers then, therefore, would give us insight into different aspects of the organizational system now. The answers would go beyond the team itself and say, okay, the time here was not enough. The planning could be improved. If this team did X, we would have that happen and that would help us. If that another department did something else in that way, that would help us. And that would probably shed light on dependencies between not only teams as in operational teams, but also between different departments whose decisions and resources they provide co-create the risk overall and contribute in different ways to the overall variability that this operational team needs to deal with.
Marcin, thank you. This is exactly why I was so excited to have you on this. I think you're just that answer just draws a line through so many pieces of how emergency care works in hospitals, and I love it. I'm gonna echo back one or two things to make sure that I'm
Mm.
understanding them right, and then I think
Mhm.
I'm gonna be able to leverage off of that. So as I'm understanding this, the way you're describing it, every piece of work faces challenges from
Mhm.
something in the environment. And it is the way that the goal of that work interfaces with those challenges that creates the
Mhm.
variability as people adapt to those challenges. And that works at whatever scale we're paying attention to. Now, no matter what the outcome of the work is, we can go back and talk to people about that variability and ask
Mhm.
them questions about it. Questions like, what made doing this work challenging, particularly
Mhm.
here? What would you need differently to de-risk this or change the amount of risk you're using? And what did you adapt around the system in order to make it happen? And in doing so, those types of questions are, I don't know, I want to make a weird analogy here, but x-rays into the middle of the system so that you can actually see the underlying structure of what's in
Mm.
there.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah, yeah.
uh,
Yeah,
okay? Awesome.
fantastic. Great. I would just simply add that people typically do not conceptualize their own actions and behaviors and decisions as adaptations because it's just normal. Look, I don't have this tool, I need that tool, I just go with it. And so what I find is asking questions about challenges and frustrations tends to reveal the those challenges external to the person and how they dealt
Mm,
with that without over jargoning
mm,
the conversation. But I love the point. Yes, you've got an insight into the dependencies between different teams and departments in organizations, and therefore that reveals a true structure, not the hierarchical design on paper somewhere in the human resources department that shows the reporting lines, but actually highlights the true flows both of information and resources, and therefore dependencies between different teams.
we're recording this middle of June, and this is really top of mind for us right now in the American healthcare system. The new doctors are just starting, right? So they've just graduated from medical school and they're just joining the teams in the hospitals to learn their specialties. So yesterday I was working with at LA General Hospital, our incoming new intern class, and starting to teach them, okay, here's what it is to be an emergency physician. And as they're coming in, all of the people above them are also promoting at the same time, right? So
Mhm.
we have people that are going from student to intern, from intern to junior operator, from junior operator to team leader and senior, and all of those new things they have to think through and
Yeah.
learn. And it's interesting thinking about what is the way, like how much of what we're teaching them is medical knowledge and how
Mhm.
much is systems knowledge of how to apply that medicine in this hospital at this point in time, right?
Mhm.
Which is really getting at what you're describing. Because in order
Yeah.
to do our work, we have to understand the theory of work, but we also have
Mhm.
to understand how work actually operates in this space, in this field, in this moment. And in all of us who've been in emergency medicine for a long enough time have some story in our head where we needed some piece of equipment and that
Mhm.
equipment happened to be behind some door. And it turns out on holiday weekends, that door is locked and the only person that has a key is off site
Yeah.
for whatever reason, because nobody thought about this fact
Mhm.
that, oh,
Mhm.
holiday weekends, people still have emergencies.
Yeah.
So understanding and it really, we're getting at work is done versus work is imagined here. So how do we think work happens versus how does work actually happen? And where do we see that disconnect between those two things? And how do we use that to better understand the system?
Yeah.
There's two directions that I think would be good to go from that. One is when you do understand more about the system as it actually operates, how do you teach people to join that system or operate in that system? So that's like the July problem, the new interns coming in. But
Yeah.
the other is, how do you actually learn about that system? So you mentioned one or two questions. First off, you mentioned the challenge that most people don't think this way about their own work. They just do the work. And
Yeah.
so some of these questions about what's challenging to you, or what would you have done, what would you need to make that even easier for you? We had another guest on the podcast, Diane Chadwick Jones, who also operates a lot in this space, who gave me one of my favorite questions, which is, somebody that's like you, but not quite as good at your job,
Hmm.
what would they struggle with? Which I just
Hmm.
think is brilliant. But like, how else can you, I guess maybe let's tackle that one first before we tackle teaching. But how else do you learn from folks around this? How do you guide them through the process of uncovering these structures and looking at the stuff that they normally take for granted?
Okay. So a couple points. I love the paper from Eric Holnagel on what you look for is what you find. In this paper, Eric demonstrated that the findings from the accident investigations were, in a way, predetermined by the accident causation model that was being used in the investigation. And that's resonated because for me as a psychologist, I could take it to another level. I see how our mental model that we have, which is our representation in our heads of how things function out there, determines our ability to see because it influences the questions that we ask, it influences what we focus on, it shapes what we are not paying attention to. The mental model influences the language that we have and the linguistic structures that we use. And therefore, I would say that in order to start learning from normal work, we need to start even with mindset first, even before we get to the techniques. I've had experience where we were using a technique called walk through, talk through, which is fairly simple conversation when you break a task into steps and then you ask what makes it difficult for each step. So it's a bit more structured conversation. And this once we gave it to the supervisor who wasn't trained in the concepts and ideas of that, and so she went to had the conversation with the worker, used the template, went through the steps, came back frustrated, saying, "Look, this is waste of my time. Why did you do this to me? There is nothing new. I found more of the same. There are hazards and people are complacent, and so we just need to strengthen our discipline to that." And then we had a person who was trained in learning from normal work, and they took the same template, the same conversation structure, reviewed the same workstation with the same person, and came back and said, "Oh, that was interesting. We've learned they don't have this and they struggle with that. And yes, there are hazards, but in addition to hazards, there are those other things." And you had the same tool, the same task, the same workstation, the same physical environment, the same process that these people went through. And yet you had very different interpretations or results because they were finding different things because they had different mental models. And so seeing the challenges associated with the work it's like a lens in using our glasses. And in order to see clearly, we need to learn how to use this lens. And that also applies, taking it further. We talked a little bit about team dynamics and
Mhm.
organizational systems to see the informal structure of the flow of information and resources between teams and departments. You need to have a mental concept of such a thing, and you need to know what to focus on and who to ask and how to ask in order to start revealing it. And so for me, this is the foundational piece that is an enabler of success. I've
Mm.
seen many organizations who jumped into tools
Sure.
without the upgrading mental model. And what it resulted to is just relabeling. So they were
Mm.
finding more of the same, they were calling it differently, but this effort was dying quickly because they said, okay, there is no value in it, there is no new things. I'm spending time, I'm investing my resources, and there's little value insight that I'm getting out of it. So there is that element. And so from there, we can ask question, okay, so how do we help people to transition
Yeah.
the mental model? Because we need a different interpretation of reality. We need a different interpretation of behavior. So we can see somebody doing something, and one lens is we say, oh, this is violation or this is unsafe act. or we can say this is adaptation. And depending on the interpretation, we'll have different insight. Because if I say this is violation, I go into, okay, violations require consequence management and some sort of punitive measure. If I say this is adaptation, I go, okay, adaptation to what exactly?
Right.
And therefore different insight results from that. And so now how do we achieve that shift? So telling people that they should be seeing things differently is not effective at all. There is place for overall awareness raising, but awareness is not enough to achieve the transformation. So this is where we do the more interactive workshops, so when we put people in simulated situations and put them in situations that require adaptations. So in fact, they could see for themselves and experience that, okay, given that set of constraints in that simulated scenario, I wouldn't actually stop the job, or I wouldn't do the ideal thing. I would do this because it makes sense given the circumstances and constraints that I'm under. And it's that experiential learning, whether through simulated scenarios, or we also can help people to go to decide and then build on that and start exploring the work through the templates and checklists that we provide. It's that experiential learning that then leads to aha moments, and then being able to upgrade that mental model and say, okay, I see now the person didn't follow procedure because the procedure doesn't account for A, B, and C, and step 3 is not actually applicable. And this is because the process for writing, reviewing, and managing procedures has these problems and constraints over there. And so I emphasize it because this is foundational piece that really makes a difference between deep value and transformation versus just doing more activities that are not necessarily bring out. And from there, once we have a mindset in place, then we start talking about tools and techniques. And so
Great.
here we may have the questioning techniques. So whether that is asking open questions or more advanced techniques from cognitive interviewing, such as TEDS, tell, explain, describe, and show. And whether this is also what the questions focus on. So the question can focus on why did you do this? So focus on you as a person doing the work, or the questions can focus on things external to the person. And we find that questions focused on things external to the person tend to be perceived as more collaborative, more caring, because they don't threaten self-esteem and they don't hint that there is something wrong about you, while at the same time they help to reveal the challenges that people face. And then there is a spectrum of tools, from simple conversations that can use some of those techniques to walkthrough talkthrough I mentioned, which is a more structured, where we take a task, break it down into steps, to learning teams and other forms of group discussions and collaborations that then tend to reveal more the dependencies and those threads of dependencies between teams, departments, and divisions.
Man, love it so much here. And this idea that if you just start applying things without really changing the mindset you have looking at them, that's so powerful. I think that's incredibly important. So if you're somebody who's listening to this in or out of the emergency department, and you're starting to think to yourself, okay, this is super interesting. I want to start peeling the film off my eyes here and looking a little bit more at the workflows around me to start approaching that and start understanding that. What would your advice be for that person? Let's say I'm an ER doctor working in an emergency department, or I'm a firefighter working a fire, and whether or not I'm the one in control, right? Maybe I'm the team leader, maybe I'm not. I'm really starting to get interested now in looking at the work around me in a different way. How do I start that process?
Yeah, reading is probably a good starting point, just to wrap your head around what it is in a little bit more detail and have exposure to some examples. So we've got this guidance you mentioned at the beginning, IOGP 642, Learning from Normal Work. That's the guidance published in oil and gas that I had privilege leading the writing effort of. And also on my website, learningfromnormalwork.com, there's lots of free resources and materials, and case studies and examples and links to get people started wrapping their head around that. And of course, it could be taken further from there. But the starting point is explore what is already available and what resonates with you. Also, I've recorded a number of videos introducing this, so this is also available on my YouTube channel.
Awesome. And I'll just make a plug for that IOGP 642 report. Having read that, like that is like you could hear that and say, wow, I'm never going to read this oil and gas industry report, but it's very approachable. It's really interesting and it's really worth reading. And I would highly recommend that for folks in the medical field to get a sense of how are other people thinking about this. It has a
Mm,
lot of the examples about conversations. I thought it was a really useful thing to reflect back on the work around me and the workflows around me. This idea of most of us don't think consciously about the work that we're doing. We just do the
mhm.
work. And that leaves things on the table, right? That
Yeah.
leaves learning on the table, that leaves improvement on the table. It also is a good reminder that sometimes you don't know what you're blind to around you, and that
Yeah.
the other people going on your team, working on your team or working in your system might actually be having very different experiences than you are, even though you all are ostensibly doing the same thing at the same time. I think for a more junior operator, that's a really important thing to start thinking about early. For a more senior operator or a team leader, it's
Mm,
both humbling and important to realize you might not be seeing the same reality as everybody around you. So
yeah.
I would read that. I think that's really worth it. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So folks are going to listen to this and they're going to think, all right, I got to look at the stuff I'm blind at. I'm going to go read more about it. How do you start having conversations with the folks around you about this? Because a lot of the threads that you were discussing have a bit of an outsider element to them, right? You are going back and forth between shoveling coal in the C suite and
Mhm.
working with the different people and talking to them. You can come in when you're not on shift and ask people, hey, how did this go and why? And how can we
Mhm.
improve this process? And what are the challenges you're facing? What about from the inside view? How do people do this from the inside? So you're on shift and you're in between critical events and you have a few minutes to think this through. Are there frames or conversations that are worth having in that moment? Or is this more a thing that has to happen separate from the actual flow of work?
And perhaps your question here prompts my follow-up question that I'll try to answer. But what's the purpose of learning? And who is learning from whom? That's another angle. Because one purpose of learning may be the self-improvement. So here is how can I become a better professional and further develop my skill, my understanding, my thinking, my mental model. And here, yeah, sure, we can have a debrief that focuses on not only what went wrong, which will focus the answers in a certain way,
Mhm.
but also on what surprised us and what we would need to do it better. And I'm highlighting that because for me, typically when we say, okay, we learn from failure and then we learn from success. And so that could lead many people then take a lead that, okay, so we ask what went well. Okay, but the question, what went well, is actually not as powerful as we imagine. And I did some testing a couple of years ago, and we had a project that was executed ahead of time and on budget. And we had this learning team focus on that question, what went well? And so people said, okay, we had tools that we needed. We had good processes that were workable. We had good supportive supervision who was helpful. And they gave that list of those different factors. And then it's okay. And now what? Should I go now to a different site and say, hey, you should have good procedure, good supervisor, and the right tools? Yeah, it's kind of not
Mhm.
that insightful, so to speak. But when we ask, okay, what were the challenges and frustrations, and what would you need next time? That started revealing
Mhm.
gaps in that ecosystem of flows and interfaces and interactions. Oh, it would be good if this happened and if that happened, and we had to deal with that. And from that discussion, also a new quality of solutions emerge. So now coming back to your example, yeah, so we can have a debrief within the boundary of small team and ask, okay, what surprised us? What challenged us, how and what would we need? And that's one level. There also the question is now, what do we do with that information? So of course we have our personal reflection, and that's fine. But if you find that, okay, it would be really good to have that piece of equipment that is behind that closed door you mentioned earlier, now that takes us, it's no longer my personal reflection and my skill. Now I'm codependent on other
Mhm.
people. So now I need, okay, so how do we resolve that? Because who closes the door and what are the criteria that drive decisions when the doors are open and closed? And what process or system drives that criteria? And what are the incentives for implementing that criteria? And that takes us to another level. And now that the improvement or the effects of learning becomes cross-departmental.
Mhm.
And in order to execute, it's probably not as simple as now me going there to the person who closes the door and say, don't close the door, because
Right.
they do it according to certain criteria and process that they were taught and that is implemented in their scope of work, right? So now we need to go to some level, a certain level of leadership and say, okay, closing the doors on weekends have unintended consequence on another department. And they may say, okay, but we've got security, so we need to bring security in. And they say, okay, but our constraint is this and that. And now the solution is no longer black and white, but is a
Mhm.
negotiation of what is most realistic given the constraints that different groups face. But even to achieve that level of constructive conversation, the mental model is still important, because I've seen
Yeah,
situations
absolutely.
where different teams would be very siloed, and they say, my goal is more important than yours, and you should adjust your workflow and your work to fit my goal. The other team was thinking the same, and that was creating conflict. At the beginning, they were not able to even have that constructive conversation because they were simply blaming each other. No, you should have done this. No, you should have done that. That's not helpful in the
Mhm.
world of dependencies. And so it takes some effort to get to the point where we can have a calm and constructive discussion about the constraints that we face, what that means to our work processes, how we affect each other, where are the hidden or side effects or unintended consequences, and from there, what we can do about it. And now that becomes partially a business effort, because now this draws resources, of
Mhm.
course, and requires alignment at higher levels, and requires conversation about plans, strategies, resource allocations, which have also cost implications. And and so there we take from a situation on the front line where I don't have a tool into actually a business strategy that through the how organizations design cascades and creates, and we call it emergent effects in complex system. Those problems emerge, and now who doctors and nurses now have to deal with the lack of the tool that is hidden in the next room that I cannot access.
Man, I wish I could go back in time and tell younger versions of myself to think a little bit more this way about it. Because I think on the inside view, right, when you're not thinking this way about it, what you're experiencing is I have a patient who's suffering. I need this tool. Why the hell did anybody lock this door? What a ridiculous thing to do. And
Yeah.
you're just so focused on what's right in front of you that you're
Hmm.
not looking at the rest of the system around you. And I think were I to have learned this earlier, I might have treated some of those circumstances quite a bit differently, as opposed to frustration or anger or saying, hey, here's another example of the emergency department being discounted for the rest of the flow of the hospital. Instead, to ask, wow, here's an interface between us and the rest of the hospital. This is an opportunity for us to better understand this structure
Mhm.
and for us to
Mhm.
collectively move forward and try to fix not just opened this door, but also what are the ways that you can use this as a case study or as a key point in a conversation to think more broadly about how
Yeah.
the emergency department and the rest of the hospital should be operating together.
Yeah.
It's a really hopeful message from that standpoint, and amazing the way that you can bridge that out to broader concepts from such a simple and relatively seemingly innocuous thing. Should this door be locked on the weekends?
Mhm.
There's a ton to learn in there. And that's I honestly think that's one of the joys of emergency work is that it's not like you can know all the science, but you also have to understand the way the system works and supports you or drags you down around you in order
Mhm.
to apply that knowledge at the moment of impact. And I guess that leads me to what I think is unfortunately going to be our last question for this, which is we've talked a lot about normal work in the sense of the flows of variability and adaptation
Mhm.
challenges that people face on a regular basis as they try to accomplish their goals. How might that apply? And I'm going to ask you to speculate here a little bit.
Mhm.
How might that apply, or how could organizations apply that when they think more about crises? Right? Things that are so far outside the average range of operations, things that are maybe rare, maybe not entirely repeatable, not quite one
Mhm.
off, because maybe they're not perfect. They're not repeating, but they rhyme, for example. So there's things that have similar threads to them. How could you stretch this to apply it to learning from crisis? Yeah, that's the mark of a good question when you ask it and somebody has to think about it for a minute.
No,
Good. All right, I'm
that,
satisfied.
that's a great question. No, thank you for that. So when it comes to crisis, this is a perhaps rare or somewhat somehow unique set of circumstances that people need to respond to. Now, how they respond can be partially explored. In oil and gas, for example, we would have emergency response teams that would plan for different scenarios and would practice response based on simulation. So let's imagine this happens, and then we plan because we need to get prepared for collaboration, communication, alignment, and different elements, ensure that radios work and all that. So we practice. And in there, we within that practice, people will face variability. Oh, that this radio didn't work, or that happened, or something else not happened. So through simulations, we can also get insight into the variability. Here, I emphasize variability because if something is rare, it's more difficult to conceptualize as normal. No, it's not normal, but it's still variability, and people will be adapting, and we can learn from variability. And then if this rare event actually happens, then we have time for a debrief and reflection, whether if we handled it well, or if the outcome was desired, or if the outcome was not as desired. Both situations offer opportunities for learning. And I presume that the outcomes that are more on the positive side, perhaps in healthcare, are more common than the undesired outcomes. And so from that, the questions on what surprised us, what, as in what happened that we didn't expect, but also what was the demand on me that I didn't know how to deal with,
Mm.
and what would I need next time, then that is, these questions would still apply and would still, I think, result in helpful insights. But then equally, it's really about individual person. So the team dynamic and asking different people, not only what would you need within that team, but what do you need or what would you need from other teams would also, I think, be very important, because the risk of success or failure is co-created by those who deal with that situation in the front line and those who are further away in the organization who provide resources, information, or co-create different constraints. And so accounting for the role of other people and other teams and shedding light on what would I need from who, and be specific. I need this team to keep the doors open on weekends, and I need that team to do something else, and that team to do something else, would create an holistic insight into how to optimize the situation that is difficult, unique, or challenging from the risk point of view.
Amazing. Amazing. That's a great answer to that. And man, I'm gonna have to think about it and absorb that a little bit and try to think about how to apply that. So thank you for that. We draw to a close here. I want to offer you a chance to issue a challenge to everybody listening to this. And that can be as straightforward as go to my website, learningfromnormalwork.com, and start digging around, or it can be broader about conversations to have in the workplace or anything like that. And I'm gonna give you a second while you're thinking about that and fill the gap here with Our normal disclaimer, which is our job here on the Emergency Mind podcast, is to take the best of what everybody else has learned about applying knowledge under pressure and push it out into the world. We are all on the same side of this problem set, learning from it together. We're not here to provide medical advice. We're just trying to make the world a better place. So, with that, what do you want to challenge folks with? What do you want folks to do differently tomorrow?
So the simple challenge would be notice how you ask questions, whether you tell, whether you suggest solutions, whether you ask close or suggestive questions, such as, is it this a problem or is that a problem? And my challenge is try to use this very simple structure. Say, tell me more about X. 3 words. Tell me more, 4 words about. And try to use that instead of those other forms, which this is very simple technique that is not as easy, therefore is a challenge, because we got used to asking questions in a certain way. But give it a go. You can do it at work, you can do it at home, you can ask your children when they get back from school, tell me more about X, and see what happens.
Awesome. Marcin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's an honor to have you. Folks, if they want to learn more, they can go to your website, learningfromnormalwork.com, and just a huge thank you.
It's wonderful. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Dan.